The Rise and Shine podcast series is made possible by the generous support of Bonnie Vozar of Chicago, Illinois.
While our story is a story of agency, our narrative is a narrative of urgency. While our story is a story of revival, our narrative is a narrative of survival. And while our story is a story of joy, our narrative is a narrative of oi.
This is Rise and Shine, a podcast that offers timeless wisdom and uplifting meditations to fill your heart, feed your soul, and start your day on a positive note. Here is Adrienne Gold-Davis.
Hello, my loyal Rise and Shine listeners around the world. Today's episode is not the usual 10-minute format. Instead, it's going to be a longer, more in-depth interview format with an extraordinary man. You know, it's not every day that one gets to be voice to voice with Dr. Zohar Raviv. He's the internationally recognized Jewish thought leader, educator, and speaker who serves as International Vice President of Educational Strategy for Taglit, Birthright, Israel, as well as being scholar in residence for both the iCenter and Momentum Unlimited. So what I want is for you to truly set aside this 30 to 40 minutes to really listen to this, because his insights, his erudition are so profound that you will likely need to listen more than once. And I hope that you'll consider sharing it with your networks and your family, because his take on the Jewish experience and its narrative are paradigm shifting. You know, he recently wrote an article that went viral in the Jerusalem Post. And that inspired me, it emboldened me actually to ask him to bring these concepts directly to us on this platform. And I was struck by one particular sentence. Listen to this. True strength is not found in the perpetual attempts to align with others' perceptions, let alone in continuous defensiveness, but in the courage to define ourselves beyond victimhood through our achievements, our values, and the profound contributions we have made to this world. If we allow fear to dictate the boundaries of our self-expression, we risk diminishing not only our voice, but the depth and the richness of our story. Whoa. So buckle up. Here is Dr. Zohar Raviv. Hi, Zohar.
Hi, Adrienne. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Oh, I feel just the same way. It's an honor for me. So I want to get right into this, okay? You have written that there is this persistent disparity between our story, who we are as Jews, how we evolved as a nation, versus our narrative, how we tell and then retell this story. So can you please explain what is that disparity and how has October 7th perhaps made this disparity even more pronounced?
Well, the disparity between what I call our story as a people and our narrative as a people is a disparity that I have identified long ago. And as I continue to research, it became very evident to me that it is part of an ongoing mechanism in the Jewish world where we continue to narrate ourselves primarily, not exclusively, but primarily through our tragedies and not necessarily through our achievements. If I had to sum up the whole experience that we're going to talk about in one sentence, and you can come back to it later on to unpack it, is I will say that while our story is a story of agency, our narrative is a narrative of urgency. While our story is a story of revival, our narrative is a narrative of survival. While our story is a story of proaction, our narrative is a narrative of reaction. And while our story is a story of joy, our narrative is a narrative of oi.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Why do you suppose that is?
Well, first of all, it is very important for me that the listener understand that I'm not blaming anybody or pointing any fingers at anyone at any given moment of our historical evolution. I think that there is no doubt that the Jewish people have withstood profound tragedies throughout our history. Neither me nor anyone else who knows Jewish history should deny that. However, my point, and that is the axis upon which the entire article was written, is that while we should remember the tragedies that have befallen us, we must never allow them to define us. And there is a fine but profound line between memory of a tragedy and allowing a tragedy to become the byword or the skeleton upon which you carry your weary body.
Whoa. I hear that, but I have to tell you, I think that part of the issue here is, for example, as I was raised without any Jewish practice, ideology, concepts, none of those things. The way that I was raised was that there was an us them world. I didn't have any of the narrative or the story of the beauty. I only had the Holocaust as a background. That's just perhaps because of my generation. So, I was raised to say you have to marry Jewish because they killed enough of us. So, how do you counteract that simplistic approach? What are we doing wrong? Should we not be doing March of the Living? Like, what do we do?
No, not at all. I'm not advocating for the elimination of or the erasure of tragedies from our personal and collective memories. All I'm saying is that we should contextualize our story in a way, or our narrative in a way, that it is more adequately corresponding with our true and genuine story. And for me, the story of the Jewish people, and that's what I wrote in the article, is not the story of what Simon Ravidovich called the story of the ever-dying people, but the story of the ever-living people. And if you look at the way we have been narrating our story, and you asked me before, why do the Jewish people narrate our story through tragedy? Let's be honest. Tragedy, first of all, yields an incredible emotional dividend. It is far easier to mobilize the masses through a harrowing story of tragedy than through a list of successes and triumphs. People are more drawn to tragedies. Their emotional faculties respond more powerfully, and people unite under a narrative that encompasses tragedy at its center.
But is that only true of the Jews? As Dara Horn wrote, people love dead Jews. I mean, our triumphs and celebrations, can be perceived as, bragging. Why are we in a position where we have had to form a narrative around this tragedy in order to get any semblance of compassion from the world? And why is that not working anymore?
Well, the reason for upholding a narrative of tragedy, I think, is profoundly complex. But if I had to put it on one leg, as it were, I would say that one reason is because the Jewish people have always been a minority within hosting majorities.
Mhm.
And the second reason is that the Jewish people have always been a minority that is hosted by, or a minority that comes from an ancient past without which our hosting majorities cannot define themselves either. In that response, I think that there is something that is both enchanting and taunting about the Jewish presence. And if you look throughout history, you see that some non-Jews, leaders, thinkers, philosophers, theologians, kings, either went towards the enchantment with the Jewish condition or went towards the other side of intimidation and loathing of that Jewish presence that reminded them that there is something even more ancient than their own ideology.
Wow, wow. As in, history is his story. So they can't co-opt our story without having to acknowledge that they rewrote over top of it, as in the Old Testament and the New Testament, by extension, says that our testament is old and outdated?
Yes, but it is still called the New Testament. And if you call something a New Testament, you obviously acknowledge that it is built on older foundations. Now, I want to make it very clear. I'm not getting into the theological discussion of right versus wrong because it's wholly irrelevant.
Right.
I'm trying to figure out, why do the Jewish people narrate their own story? Why do we narrate our own story as a constant battle against adversaries who aim to finish our story? Because my claim is that this is not our story, and we should refocus from what I called from never again, from memory, to back again, to mission.
Pooh, I love that. All right, you wrote about reactive identity. What is reactive identity?
So reactive identity is precisely, Adrienne, what I said before, that we allow ourselves to be defined by what others think about us, and we summon up most of our energy to defend our mission and to defend ourselves rather than to celebrate who we are. And you tapped into something very subtle in what you said earlier. We are so sensitive about our achievements and contributions that we constantly fear that pride might be over interpreted as arrogance.
Mm-hmm.
And I say that there is a fine line between pride and arrogance. You don't need to be arrogant about anything. That's true for any human being. But we should definitely be proud for what we have achieved. The story of the Jewish people is a story of resilience, contribution, revival, solidarity, camaraderie, mutual responsibility, invention, education, curiosity. The Jewish people have always, and I said it time and again, have demonstrated an opposite relationship between very low numbers and very great impact.
True.
These are the things that we should look into, and we should create an identity that is based on the inner mechanisms of Jewish life, rather than an identity that is reactive to outer onslaughts or threats to Jewish living.
That's exquisite. So the ABC, always be choosing. We are the always choosing people. But it seems, based on the narrative you're talking about, that the choosing that we've done over the last, say, almost 100 years has been strategically incorrect. What is the problem with having a narrative of oi as opposed to joy?
Well, first of all, why should I want to join a club that is obsessed with survival? Why would I like to be part of a people whose raison d'etre is to defend themselves or to justify their being? Second of all, I look around, I investigate our people, and that's not our story. It's simply not our story. What troubles me is that this reactive mode of thinking has expanded its branches and took over not only what happened after October 7th, but way before that and way beyond just the people. We are reactive when we talk about the state of Israel. We are reactive when we talk about Zionism. I've talked about this, written about this extensively in the article. Mm-hmm. And I said there that many people, Jews and non-Jews alike, and by the way, of those non-Jews, many of whom are staunch supporters of Israel, who primarily perceive Israel as a safe haven for the Jewish people. And I come and I say, wait a second. We must look at this clearly and understand the distinction between goal and outcome. The goal for Israel was not to build a safe haven for Jews. The goal for Israel is not about survival, but it is revival of an ancient story, an ancient connection between the people of Israel and the land of Israel. Once Israel was established, one of the outcomes of its establishment is that it became, among other things, also a safe haven for Jews who might have suffered persecutions around the globe. But that is not the raison d'etre for its for its inauguration and rebuilding. The story of Israel is a story of revival, not a story of survival. The same thing, Adrienne, is about Zionism.
So, given what you've discussed, I think it's important for our listeners that you define Zionism for us. Its historical, cultural, and spiritual roots, looking at it more holistically and not as the safe haven.
Well, that's exactly the point that I was trying to make as well.
Okay.
Many people believe that Zionism started in the last quarter of the 19th century in Western Europe as a reactive response to the onslaught of anti-Semitism throughout the European continent, and an aspiration which was proven essential tenfold after the Holocaust. In other words, people perceive Zionism as a responsive mechanism that aimed to allow Jews to survive persecution. That is a criminal neglect of the context of Zionism. And what we see today is precisely that Zionism has been perpetually decontextualized in social discourse. And my goal as an educator is to reclaim that context.
All right.
So when we talk about Zionism, we need to distinguish between the Zionist movement, whose impetus was indeed securing that Jews don't need to undergo persecution and reaffirming their right as a people for self-determination as a nation. But that movement has absolutely no justification whatsoever if we don't see it in the broader context of Zionism as an ancient ideal of the Jewish people from their nascent appearance on the historic stage. And in that respect, the founding parents of Zionism are Abraham and Sarah, not Theodor Herzl.
Right, because my understanding is that the purpose of the Exodus from Egypt was to receive Torah at Sinai and then go into the land of Israel to actualize all of that potential. And is that incorrect?
That.
Okay, so if that's the case, how do you deal with this dialectic? Somebody said to me the other day that Israel is an example of the first decolonized state when we went back there. But given, the zeitgeist around colonization and the lack of understanding of Zion as Israel, as Jerusalem, by the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down and remembered Zion, because people have no historical perspective. How do you answer this question of Zionism when people might respond, and this is a tough one, by saying, I don't want to hear about your biblical nonsense. I don't believe in any of that.
Well, if you don't believe in my so-called biblical nonsense, then you need to ask yourself a very profound question of how do you identify as a Jew, because as hard as it may be for a critic to understand or accept, the very term Jew is a biblical term. In other words, we cannot divorce who we are from our own past. Whether you agree with that past or you don't, it is still your past. And I think that, and you heard me say that before, if someone who criticizes what I say in such a manner, and it's a legitimate and acceptable criticism, of course, but I would say that any generation that does not remember its past or does not take the time to learn its past, not to agree with its past, but to understand what it disagrees with, to learn it. Any generation who ignores its past forfeits its own right to be remembered by its future. So as long as you see yourself as part of a bigger story, and for me, if you call yourself a Jew, you immediately acknowledge that you are part of a bigger story, because the term Jew is a family name, is a surname, is not a personal name. My personal name is Zohar. Your personal name is Adrienne, and we are both Jews. By acknowledging yourself as a Jew, you acknowledge that you are part of a bigger story. And I invite us to wrestle with that story. But to say I dismiss the story is, for me, as a matter of fact, a cowardly act of comfort rather than a courageous act of intellectual discomfort. And wisdom can only come from intellectual discomfort, not from a place of comfort.
Well, of course, I absolutely agree with you. And the story and our story, our collective story, informs and impacts every decision I make. But I have had repeatedly people say to me, all of these reasons for Zionism, are based on a narrative. I don't believe in any of this. And so what happens, or what I've seen happen, is that we Jews are bouncing between, here is the geopolitical reason, here are the treaties that we had, here is the recolonization, this is the promised land to the chosen people, and we bounce around depending on who we are speaking to. So what I want to ask you right now is this: why, as a modern Jew, how, as a modern Jew, do I answer that newest slur that Zionism has become?
Adrienne, I think that I said it to you before, and I remember you quoting it on another podcast that you did about our conversation. The problem today is not the content of the conversations that we have with people. Content comes, content goes. Context is far more important, but the real problem is the inability to have the conversation itself. If someone comes to me and says, Zohar, I do not accept anything that you say, that makes it exceedingly difficult to have any form of dialogue in search of a greater meaning that might or may bring me and that person together under a shared canopy for a discussion. So if I meet people of that nature, I must be very, very honest. And by the way, in my opinion, they're a minority. I tell them, look, it's not the content of the conversation that sets us apart. It's the inability to hold a conversation. And the ability to hold a conversation requires courage. And it requires courage of both sides to entertain the possibility that, God forbid, the other one has something of value to tell you.
Oh.
And I think that's what scares people the most, to entertain the possibility that their adversary may have something of value to tell them, so they may sharpen their own intellectual faculties and understanding of the world. So I seek those people who are able to entertain such a thought. And with them, I must say, very, very powerful dialogues can happen. And many of them sharpen my own faculties and allow me to re-examine things that I have grown to take for granted.
Allow you to re-examine things, or you choose to re-examine things? I think it goes back to choosing. A person has to be open to be open. They have to choose to be open, to listen. It can be very threatening, and it can move against whatever your current narrative is. I suppose we need to continually examine our narrative about everything, including our identities. And isn't that in many ways what it is to be a Jew?
In many ways it is. Actually, I will say that when I look at our Jewish textual, cultural, and spiritual legacies, I see something that strikes me as quite beautiful and quite profound. Judaism, for all intents and purposes, was never bothered by the freedom to speak. Everybody has the freedom to speak. That's not the issue. The issue is the honor of being heard.
Oh.
And in order to be heard, everybody can stand up on a pedestal and speak and say whatever they want. But not everybody will have the honor of being heard unless they bring into what they speak a context, a depth, a knowledge of opposing views, just like Bet Hillel, who made it their business to quote the words of Bet Shammai before they quoted their own words.
Right.
A depth that allows your opponent or your partner in discussion to understand that you are not coming just in order to argue, but you are coming in order to apply a dialectics of the meeting of the minds whose product is better than the two separate minds if they don't talk to each other.
Oh, so
and that's the beauty of dialogue. That's the beauty of dialogue, that I need you, Adrienne, in order to lift my intellectual, spiritual, and cultural faculties upward. I need you. I cannot do it on my own. That's why I seek those who want to talk to me. I don't seek those who want to agree with me.
Oh, Zohar. Wow. I have a lot to think about now. You've made some extraordinary points, as you always do. Since we're live, do you think I might be able to tempt you into doing another one of these with me at some point?
Of course. I'm always very, very happy to discuss issues with you, Adrienne. You've been a friend and a colleague for many years now, and it's a joy to sit with you and brainstorm together, of course.
I'm grateful for you. The world should be grateful for you. You're an extraordinary, extraordinary mind. And thank you. Thank you for this. And I am sure that everyone listening will play this on repeat. Please share it. Listen to what he has to say. It's up to each and every one of us, I believe, to move this forward in a way that our narrative turns into one that is more joy and less oi, to quote him, and that we can become agents of hope. Thanks, everybody. I'll speak to you next week.
Thanks for listening to Rise and Shine. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to Momentum Podcasts on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Join Adrienne again next time for more timeless wisdom and uplifting meditations that fill your heart, feed your soul, and start your day on a positive note.
This podcast was made possible by the generous support of Bonnie Vozar of Chicago, Illinois. Spread the wisdom. Inspire Jewish individuals around the globe by supporting Momentum's podcasts. To sponsor, contact podcast@momentumunlimited.org. You're listening to a Momentum podcast. For unlimited inspiration, wisdom, and empowerment, visit momentumunlimited.org.